Let's talk about the Epstein files, because what surfaced now is not just another scandal headline, not just another document dump, and not just another wave of online outrage. This is one of those moments that quietly forces America to look at itself in the mirror and ask a question most people sense instinctively but rarely articulate out loud: how power really behaves when it is threatened by truth. The release itself is massive. Millions of pages, years of material, names, contacts, references, fragments of a world that most Americans will never enter and never be invited into. And as people start scanning the documents, one fact immediately dominates the conversation. Donald Trump's name appears repeatedly, not as a single passing reference, not as a marginal footnote, but as a recurring presence within the broader ecosystem that surrounded Jeffrey Epstein. Now, let's establish something clearly from the start, because this matters for credibility and seriousness. A name in documents is not a conviction. A reference is not proof of a crime. Law does not work that way, and anyone pretending otherwise is not interested in justice. They're interested in noise, and noise is exactly what powerful systems rely on to avoid accountability. But politics is not a courtroom alone. Politics is trust. It is judgment. It is narrative consistency. It is whether the person asking for power has lived by the values they claim to represent. And that is where this story becomes deeply uncomfortable for Donald Trump. Because Trump's rise was never just about policy. It was about identity. He did not sell voters a program. He sold them a story. The story of the outsider, the billionaire who somehow wasn't like other billionaires, the man who spoke the language of ordinary people while claiming to wage war against elite corruption, the figure who promised to expose hidden networks, secret deals, and protected classes. That promise is the foundation of his political legitimacy. And Jeffrey Epstein is the living symbol of everything Trump said he was fighting. Epstein represents elite impunity in its purest form: private jets crossing borders without scrutiny, private islands beyond public reach, social circles where money dissolves consequences, institutions that looked away, investigations that stalled, victims whose voices were ignored. This was not theoretical corruption. This was corruption operating openly, protected by wealth and proximity to power. So when Trump's name appears again and again inside the records connected to this world, the damage is not primarily legal. It is narrative. It strikes at the heart of the myth. You cannot convincingly position yourself as the enemy of elite culture while having moved comfortably within the same elite environment that allowed Epstein to exist for decades. That is not revolution. That is contradiction. And this is where Trump deserves serious, expert-level criticism, not emotional attacks, not partisan slogans, but structural analysis. Trump does not approach truth as a principle. He approaches it as a tactical asset. When transparency harms his enemies, he demands transparency. When transparency threatens his image, he questions motives. He casts doubt. He shifts attention. He reframes. He treats disclosure as a weapon, not as a civic obligation. That approach is fatal to real accountability, because accountability only works if the rule applies universally. The moment truth becomes selective, justice becomes factional. And Trump has spent years teaching Americans exactly that lesson: that institutions matter only when they serve your side, and corruption matters only when it belongs to your opponents. This is not how systems get cleaned. This is how systems rot further. Now consider the deeper context of Epstein himself, because understanding that context is essential. Epstein was not powerful because of who he was. He was powerful because of who he knew. His role was not ideological, it was connective. He linked people who mattered: money, politics, finance, influence, intelligence-adjacent circles. He operated in the spaces where formal rules blur and informal protection takes over. That is why his network matters more than his crimes, because his crimes were allowed to continue precisely because of that network. So when Trump appears inside that social ecosystem, the question is not about guilt by association. The question is about credibility by association. How does someone claim to be outside the system while operating comfortably within its most exclusive layers? The uncomfortable truth is this: there is no such thing as an outsider at that level of wealth and power. Billionaire real estate circles, global finance, luxury aviation, elite philanthropy, these are closed ecosystems. You do not accidentally enter them. You do not wander into them. You are vetted, welcomed, integrated. You attend the same events. You share the same intermediaries. You meet the same people. You move through the same protected spaces. You can attack politicians rhetorically and still be fully embedded in elite culture. Trump did exactly that. This is why Epstein's files are politically dangerous for Trump, even if they never become legally dangerous. They collapse the illusion. Trump didn't destroy elite power. He reorganized it. Different donors, different billionaires, different media allies, same structure, same incentives, same culture of protection, just louder language and better branding. And this matters because Trump supporters did not rally around him for technocratic competence. They rallied around him because they believed he was different, because they believed he would burn the system down rather than manage it. The Epstein files quietly suggest the opposite, that Trump was never truly outside, that he simply understood the system well enough to navigate it while attacking it publicly. That is not rebellion. That is survival. Now let's talk about Trump's behavior once the Epstein issue enters the public sphere, because behavior under pressure reveals more than any document. Trump does not respond to uncomfortable scrutiny with openness. He responds with deflection, with minimization, with reframing, with counteraccusation. This is not speculation. It is a consistent pattern across multiple controversies. When exposure benefits him, he encourages it. When exposure threatens him, he discredits the process. That selective approach to truth is precisely what Trump claims to oppose in others, and this is where the critique becomes sharp and unavoidable. You cannot credibly argue that institutions are corrupt while demanding their protection when scrutiny turns towards you. You cannot position yourself as the champion of victims while dismissing systemic investigations as witch hunts the moment they intersect with your own world. That is not leadership. That is narrative preservation. And the cost of that behavior is not limited to Trump's reputation. It spills into the entire political culture, because the Epstein case is not really about Epstein anymore. Epstein is dead. The victims deserve justice, but the perpetrator is gone. The real question now is whether American institutions can still investigate power honestly without collapsing into partisan warfare, and Trump's style makes that harder, not easier. He trains the public to see investigations as political weapons rather than civic processes. He encourages people to ask, who benefits, instead of what is true. That mindset does not protect democracy. It erodes it. Now consider how this document release was handled. Millions of pages released at once, heavily processed, difficult to navigate. For the average citizen, this is not transparency. It is overload. It creates confusion rather than clarity. It invites selective interpretation rather than comprehensive understanding. In theory, transparency empowers the public. In practice, unstructured transparency can paralyze it, and Trump thrives in that chaos. Because chaos fragments attention. Chaos prevents synthesis. Chaos turns serious questions into partisan shouting matches. This is the environment where accountability dies. If you truly wanted justice, you would demand structure, you would demand clear timelines, verified summaries, independent oversight, sequenced disclosure, context. But if you want spectacle, you flood the system with raw material and let influencers, partisans, and algorithms do the rest. Trump's entire political method is built on flooding the zone with claims, counterclaims, distractions, outrage, and noise. In that environment, no single truth can dominate long enough to demand consequences. And that is why the Epstein files matter beyond the immediate scandal. They test whether America can still slow down, think clearly, and separate fact from faction. Now let's bring this back to the American people, because this is not an elite debate. This is about trust. For decades, Americans have felt that the rules apply differently depending on who you are, that small crimes are punished aggressively while large crimes dissolve into settlements, that powerful people walk away while ordinary people pay the price. This feeling did not come from nowhere. It was shaped by real experiences, financial crises without accountability, corporate fraud with no prison time, political scandals that quietly disappear. Epstein fits perfectly into that pattern, and Trump rode that frustration to power. But here is the cruel irony. Instead of dismantling the culture that protects elites, Trump normalized it by turning it into a loyalty system. Justice becomes conditional. Truth becomes tribal. Accountability becomes selective. That does not heal distrust. It deepens it. So when Americans watch millions of pages released and still feel unsure what actually happened, who is responsible, and who is protected, the emotional result is not empowerment. It is cynicism. People don't say, "Now we know the truth." They say, "We will never know the truth." And that belief is corrosive, because once people stop believing truth exists, they stop believing participation matters. They disengage, or worse, they cling to simplistic narratives that offer emotional certainty instead of factual accuracy. This is how societies become vulnerable. Not because people are ignorant, but because they are exhausted. Trump's politics accelerates that exhaustion. He presents himself as the antidote to corruption while behaving like its product. He attacks institutions while demanding their loyalty. He claims to speak for ordinary Americans while having lived his entire life insulated from their consequences. And the Epstein files place that contradiction under a harsh light. They don't prove crimes. They don't resolve guilt. They expose proximity. They remind Americans that power is not only exercised through policy, but through access, through relationships, through environments where some people are protected long before laws are broken. And Trump was part of that environment. That is the uncomfortable truth his movement struggles to reconcile. Because if Trump is not the outsider, then the promise collapses. And when the promise collapses, something dangerous fills the vacuum. People don't suddenly return to trusting institutions. They double down on distrust. They assume everyone is corrupt. They assume accountability is impossible. They become receptive to more extreme narratives, more radical solutions, more authoritarian logic. This is not hypothetical. This is how democratic decay works. Not through one scandal, but through accumulated disappointment. So the real question Americans should ask is not, is Trump guilty? That question belongs in courts, not talk shows. The real question is this: can a man who was socially embedded in elite culture credibly lead a movement against elite corruption? Can someone who treats truth as a tactical asset be trusted to enforce it universally? Can a leader who thrives in chaos deliver accountability in a system that requires discipline? The Epstein files do not answer those questions definitively, but they force them into the open. And Trump's reaction to that pressure will matter more than any document ever could, because leadership is not measured by how loudly you accuse others. It is measured by how you respond when scrutiny turns towards you. So far, Trump's record is clear. He deflects, he reframes, he attacks the process, he does not invite examination, he resists it, and that tells Americans something fundamental about the kind of power he represents: not reformist power, not transformative power, but adaptive power, the power to survive inside a system while pretending to fight it. And that is the final uncomfortable truth Americans must confront as they watch this story unfold. The Epstein files are not just about who was mentioned. They are about whether America still believes that no one is above scrutiny, and whether the loudest man in the room is willing to live by the same rules he demands for everyone else, because if he isn't, then the myth is over, and all that remains is a system that knows how to protect itself no matter who is standing at the podium.